there's never two hailstorms that are identical. They're always different, and it's always amazing just how much variability you can get in a field. 100 yards away, you can have plants that are practically not damaged at all, and then plants that are completely wiped out. So assessing damage is never easy when it comes to hail. From a sorghum standpoint, and really corn too, there's different kinds of damages. There's just outright stand reduction that you've got to look for. I mean, a plant is completely gone. You take that into account. You have to take into account stalk damage. If the sorghum is already headed, then actual head damage. But I think in this case, in the area there probably was not any sorghum that had headed out yet. So from that standpoint, that's a good thing. And then of course, just defoliation. It's very easy to overestimate how much of the leaf materials is gone. And so, if you think there's 75% leaf damage or defoliation, it's probably closer to 50%. It's just real easy to overestimate that. Stalk damage can be hard to assess, and there's no real easy way to do that quickly. The best kind of hail, really, if you're going to label a hail as being good, is that comes straight down. And then primarily what you're looking at there is defoliation. You don't have any stalk damage. But when you have hail that's going horizontal, then you're going to have a lot more stalk damage. And that, in the long run, can be much more damaging. The only way really to assess that, whether it's sorghum or corn, really is you've got to split the stalks and see how deep a potential bruise will be. A lot of times you'll just have a lot of scarring of the leaf sheath that's surrounding that stalk, and it'll look like it's bruised, but maybe it's not. It's just a scar there. And so you dig into that stalk a little bit deeper, you can see how deep that bruise goes. Well, certainly if that bruise goes very deep, you're in all likelihood going to lose that stalk. So it takes some time to assess that, but it's important that you do that because that's going to be very important. Sorghum, of course, has the ability to compensate pretty well for storms like this to some extent because of the tillering that sorghum can do. That can be kind of good and bad because depending on what stage the sorghum is in, if the sorghum is fairly far along, maybe you're getting close to boot stage, for example, and you have a hailstorm that knocks out that main stalk, and maybe even some of those side tillers, yeah, that sorghum's going to retiller. But what's going to happen, you're going to end up with basically multiple crops out there where you've got the main stalk that's producing grain, and then 30, 40 days later, you got a tiller that comes on and is going to produce grain. So that is not necessarily a good thing. So the earlier the damage occurred, in other words, the smaller the sorghum is when you get the hail, the better off you are by far. Sorghum can probably, data that I've seen, you can probably reduce the overall stand by 30, 35% and really not see any yield loss strictly from removing plants. So you can lose, again, a fair number of plants and still be okay. Even a significant gap in the sorghum row. I've seen research where you can get a 6 to 8 foot gap in a row, and as long as the adjacent rows are okay, the sorghum can actually compensate and you'll see very little yield loss. So it does have that ability. That being said, there's a point where you've just got to cut your losses and consider just terminating the crop and then replanting if it's severe enough. I have seen in the past when you have a pretty severe hail, and it's really the plants are fairly uniform as far as being torn up and messed up, is actually going in and shredding the tops so that everything is more uniform when it comes back. That is an option, but that's kind of an extreme option. But if the damage is bad enough, then that's something to look at, I think. But again, when you go to assess damage, I think the first thing you're looking for is what is your stand, So you've got to make stand counts. Again, I think you can lose a third of what you originally planted and still be probably okay from a yield standpoint, as long as those gaps just aren't tremendously big. You get into that 50% stand reduction, either due direct plant loss or stalk damage, then there I think you're looking at maybe needing to do something different. So that's sort of some general thoughts. Be glad to take some questions on sorghum, or however you guys want to do this.
Any questions for Brent out there?
Brent, this is Josh. If we would need to go out there and do a stand count, so if the hailstorm was on Thursday night, how long do we need to wait till we know if those plants are damaged or not?
Yeah, that's a good question. And you can start seeing that bruises on those stalks pretty quick. I would I'd give it 7 days anyway, though, before I get very serious about looking at the sorghum to see how deep those bruises are, because you do want those bruises. For the bruises to show up, that tissue's got to basically deteriorate, and so you got to give it a little time. Assuming you're going to have good warm weather, you've had a rain with this, that plant's going to start trying to grow, and the damage that's going to be there is going to show up pretty quick. So I would think after 7 days, you ought to be able to get in and be able to assess the damage pretty well, considering we are going to, I think, have good weather conditions this week. So Thursday or so, I think you can get out and start really looking and assessing damage. I mean, if it's bad enough, I mean, you may be able to tell right now that it's just a complete loss, but hopefully that's not the case. Probably isn't in most cases. And so give it a week. I think you've got time here. I mean, what are you going to do at this point? So give it some time before you make a decision on what to do. I think in you guys' area, I think you've still got, if you do decide to go back with sorghum, you've got a fair amount of time to do that. You've probably got a month where you can plant sorghum, and so you've got time to, I think, to assess the damage here and see what happened. But I'd give it a week.
I think that's a good point to make with replant options and considering the timeline. Because I know we've seen some really great fall sorghum crops in this area that are planted, midsummer and that mature out into the fall that have done really well in the past. So that is an option to fall back on, and sorghum is one of the less expensive crops to have to replant. So maybe that's something to consider if we're at a total loss. Brent, I'm wondering physiologically, with whenever you have bruising on the stem, what is the downstream consequence here? Are we just reducing the ability to pollinate and fill grain, or is it overall? What will you see at harvest? Is that stalk going to not make it all, or kind of? I know there's a wide range of fluctuation here, but could you shed a little light on what's actually happening with that damage relative to the way grain develops?
Yeah, good question. And the key is just how deep that bruise is. And so certainly if that bruise goes halfway through that stalk, I would count that stalk as being gone. It might survive for a week or two, but at some point you're going to get hotter weather and it's trying to, move water up through that stalk. And at some point it's just going to give up and die. Same thing happens with wheat. You see that a lot with wheat on stalk damage. It looks good for 2 weeks, and then at some point it just can't compensate for the hot weather and the evapotranspiration demand, and it dies. And so, that certainly can happen. The other thing that can happen, maybe the bruise isn't that deep, but it's enough that it's going to basically create a wound there, and that sorghum plant is going to get infected, and you're going to have charcoal rot or maybe fusarium, and you're going to end up with lodging later on. Pretty severe lodging, and that lodging may occur earlier than we would normally think lodging would occur. So that's another thing that can happen. So evaluating that stalk damage is really important. But again, a lot of times if that hail was just kind of straight down, those bruises, it really won't be a bruise. There'll just be some scarring on that leaf sheath. The other thing to look for is where the bruise occurred. in relationship to the growing point of that sorghum. The growing point of the sorghum, roughly 35 days after emergence, that growing point is going to be above the ground. So, every day after that point, that growing point gets higher and higher. And so if the bruise occurred above that growing point, not really a big deal. That growing point is going to keep growing and more likely just push through that damage and be fine. If the bruise occurred below the growing point, then that's when you've got an issue. And so that's what you want to look for, I think, on where that bruise occurred in relationship to the growing point. And the growing point's easy to see once you split that stalk. You can see where that growing point is.
We got another question in the chat here from Doug about whether there is a need for foliar fungicide after hail. Brent, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, good question. And the temptation is always, I've got to get out there and do something. And so after a hailstorm, people are they've always got their own kind of special brew of mix they want to put on a hail damaged crop. And to be honest, I don't think much of it usually does much good. If the crop was short on micronutrients before the hail, then it's short on it now. Or if micronutrients were good before, then they're good again. They're good now. So I'm not a big believer in going out and putting a lot of foliar fertilizer on. From a fungicide standpoint, though, that is the one thing that to me does make some sense. Because again, those plants they have wounds, and so they've opened up that plant for disease. And so kind of a broad spectrum fungicide to me, if you're going to do something, putting on a fungicide, I think makes the most sense.
Would one of our cheaper azole options like propiconazole or tebuconazole be appropriate for that, just to basically hit where those wounds are? We might not get the long residual control, but maybe prevent infection at the time without having to spend too much, or what are your thoughts on different types of fungicides?
A lot of new fungicides out there now, and I'm sure a lot of them work really well, but I guess if it were me, I'd be looking at more of the cheaper options on the fungicides. Maybe a mix of two active ingredients on the fungicide stand, but you can get those. I mean, what is it? I think Quilt is a combination of two of those active ingredients. And so I think something like that that's not going to break the bank, I think potentially could do some good in just protecting that crop from diseases that where that hail has just opened up that plant to that possibility. Going back to cotton, following sorghum or corn, I think you really got to look at that herbicide that you put on either one of those crops, because atrazine can be an issue, certainly going back to cotton in your sorghum. The mesotrione, that is labeled for both sorghum and corn, so you could go back with sorghum behind the corn crop. The peroxysulfone or residua, that's a little more iffy, but not really. It's not labeled for sorghum, but I've seen enough studies that, if you put the residua out a month ago, then I think it's going to be fine to plant sorghum at this point, if you were thinking about doing that instead of going back with corn. Something else I'll mention, the fact that we've had so much defoliation, that opens up that canopy. And so, again, something to consider is going to be the weed control going forward. And if you do have still what you think is a good potential crop, I would actually think about it in a sorghum crop going back over the top with something like a metolachlor dual, just to give you another herbicide there, some residual to maybe help you get through the rest of the summer, because weed control potentially is going to be more of an issue since that canopy has been opened up.
Plowing it under?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I mean, because the sorghum is going to tiller, and I think after this hail, and so you could give it a little bit of time and get those tillers to going. You're at least going to be able to utilize those tillers where in a forage crop for hay where you really couldn't or may not, as Ronnie pointed out earlier, those tillers, late tillers, just aren't going to yield much from a grain standpoint. They would actually help you from a forage standpoint. So that certainly is an option.